Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Kupyansk, and in this one there are numerous advances in favor of the Russians from the eastern outskirts of the Zaporizhia region to the central parts north of Pokrovsk, in the northeastern parts of the Donetsk region, and the eastern outskirts of the Kharkiv region. Russians managed to advance within the town of Kupyansk in the northern section, where they managed to enter into the southern parts of the railway area as they continued offensive operations to gain full control over it. The Russians also continued advances here to the northeast of Borova as they continued offensive operations east of the Usk River line, as well as in the northern flank of Lyman, gain control over an additional settlement. The Russians continued offensive operations east of Lyman as well across the Siversk river line within the Serbiansky forest area. Russians also continued offensive operations in the direction of Siversk, where they are regaining full control over the Serbiansky town. The Russians also continued offensive operations to the north of Pokrovsk, where they're looking to regain control over the areas that they have lost and free up their forces in an operational encirclement. At the same time, they continued offensive operations along the first and second line of defense within the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk region. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to make several advances along the first and second lines of defense and in between. To the south of the first line of defense, the Russians gain control over several forest lines here to the south of Olhivske, as they are aligning the front line along the Yanchia River. Once the Russians have aligned the front line along the river line, they can launch offensive operations from across the river line through the residential area and from the south through the town of Novodanylivka towards Poltavka. To the north of this, along the first defensive line in the Zaporizhia region, the Russians gain control over an additional fortified position and continue down the road along the eastern bank of the Yanchia River to gain control over the remaining fortified positions, enter the residential area, and push into Novodanylivka on the western bank of the river line. So we're seeing Russian forces lining the front line along the Yanchia River line, which will allow them to combine their forces between the southern flank, where they've already crossed over the river line, and the eastern bank of the river line. To the north of this, in the area between the first and second lines of defense, the Russians have managed to advance in a large way to the west of Novomykolaievka and northwest of Novoivanivka, gaining control over several forest lines and wide fields. This advance allowed them to gain control of the northern flank of Novodanylivka, gain a foothold in the eastern parts of the settlement, and start storming the northern and eastern parts of it. The Russians are here looking to gain control of it, securing the river line here to the north, and aligning the front line even further along the Yanchia river line. It seems the Russians are looking to advance along the river line on the entire section of the front line with these recent advances in that direction. Such a wide advance by the Russians gives them the advantage that they are on a much wider front line. That means their infantry have a much easier time of hiding in the forested areas. This allows them during their advance to avoid FPV drones as much as possible, as the Ukrainians have to survey a larger area, and the larger area has a smaller concentration of Russian forces than if they concentrated them in one direction. This also means that physical Ukrainian obstacles, fortifications, trenches, and Ukrainian soldiers deployed within these forested areas will have a better chance against the Russian forces, but with the manpower shortages of the Ukrainians, I do not expect there to be a lot, which allows for these large advances by the Russians. In the direction of Stepove along the second line of defense, the Russians are advancing from the southern flank following the capture of Kalinivske, as well as to the southwest of Kalinivske, where the Russians are developing the offensive operations along the southern bank of the defensive line to gain control over the fortifications and the road that leads further to the western direction for their supplies, while fighting continues along the defensive line north of Stepove, where the Russians are looking to gain control over the trenches to secure the northern flank of the supply line going through Kalinivske in the direction of Verbove. Moving on to the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to make a small advance here west of Stepove as they continue offensive operations along the western flank and eastern flank of the settlement. The Russian objective is to gain control over Stepove, or at the very least, gain fire control over the sole supply line that supplies the Ukrainian forces pushing in the direction of Menkivka. The Russians already have FPV drones, artillery, and so on, long-range strike capabilities targeting this road, as it is the now singular road with the northwestern road cut off to resupply their forces, gain control over additional forest lines to the east or to the west, or both, would allow the Russians to gain physical fire control over the road, allowing for forces to be deployed in the forest lines next to the road to fire directly at Ukrainian forces passing through. This would require Ukrainian counterattacks on the flanks, and it would limit the supplies going to the frontline units, which could allow the Russians to counterattack from the flanks and directly head on to push the Ukrainians away and regain control over the supply line, leading to the forces operating on the western flank here in the north of Pokrovsk. The Russians are here working on a counterattack to regain control over the supply lines, leading to their frontline units. In the northeastern direction of Siversk, we see that the Russians have managed to regain control over the fortified positions to the south of Stepove, as well as the first lines connecting to their forces further south, as Russians continue threatening the supply lines of the Ukrainian forces in the area, while some reports even suggest Russians are making river crossings here along the Siversk river line into the final parts of the Kupiansk forest area within the Luhansk region to cut off the remaining supplies of the Ukrainian forces in the area. The Russians are looking to gain full control over the first line of defense here to the north of Siversk and to secure the town of Stepove to start developing offensive operations towards Siversk itself and the flank through the supply lines. The Russians also continue offensive operations within Yampil, gain control over the eastern outskirts of the settlement along the river line, as they continue offensive operations gain full control over Yampil on the eastern flank of Lyman. For the northwestern flank of Lyman, the Russians managed to gain control over Derylove, which is an important outpost for the Ukrainian forces. Gaining control over Derylove opens the road for the Russians to reach Debreshove, where they are looking to gain control over that settlement, as well as cut off the final supply lines that supplies Lyman and this section of the front line from the northwestern direction, leaving just the southwestern and southeastern highways to resupply their forces. With the southeastern supply route leading to Siversk, the Russians cutting off that road or gaining control over Siversk would negate that, leaving only one supply route, which the Russians can bomb the crossings over the Siversk river line, or they can gain physical control of it by flanking Lyman from the south through the Siversk river line, which would become much easier with control over the settlements to the southeast of the river line in the northern flank of Siversk, with offensive operations taking place there as well. This means the Russians have an opportunity to either storm Lyman directly from the northeast and northwest, or to bypass the town from the south, cutting off all of their supply lines and encircling the Ukrainian forces in the area, potentially pushing them out to the forested areas to the north of Sloviansk and then across the river line. In either case, the Ukrainians are becoming even more difficult in the situation here within Lyman and the surrounding areas, which is complicating the situation for their forces. To the north of this, along the northeast of Borova, the Russians gain control over additional fortifications, as they are looking to gain full control over the defensive line here to the north of Novodanylivka. The Russian and Ukrainian forces have been fighting over these fortifications and fortified positions in the vicinity of Sahrizove for many months now. The Russians have been seen to operate here to the east of Sahrizove, as well as the first line to the west of Sahrizove, and the Ukrainians have been counterattacking in the area, making the entire settlement a death zone for both the Russian and Ukrainian forces fighting in the area. There are a lot of videos of bombarding of all of these fortifications and settlements in the vicinity on both Russian and Ukrainian sides. The Russians are now fighting over the fortified positions to the south of this area, allowing them to push in the direction of these fortified positions and the defensive line from the rear. These fortifications are all facing in all directions, the south, north, east, and west, allowing them to defend against Russian forces attacking from any position. However, what we are also seeing is that the Russians have been able to secure these positions and are flanking one fortified position after another. They're attacking from the eastern flank, which allows them to focus on one fortification, while the second fortification cannot support the first one. This is to gain advantage by attacking them one at a time, since there is no way to overcome the fortifications as a whole. So this has allowed the Russians to slowly develop offensive operations in the direction of these fortifications, while taking any sort of advantage possible. As for the Kupiansk direction itself, the Russians managed to make a small advance here to the west of the town, gain control over several residential areas, forested areas, and pushing through the south of the railway line. What we're seeing is that the Russians are having difficulty gaining control over the apartment complex area in the northern parts to then enter the industrial area, gaining full control over the northern part of the railway area. So they're pushing here in the south in the direction of the apartment complex area in that direction, cut off the supply lines leading to the apartment complex area and industrial area in the north by completely bypassing these fortified choke points, which the Ukrainians are using to hold back the Russian forces within the town. In conclusion, we're seeing a lot of developments in favor of the Russians across the front line from Kupiansk in the north to the first and second defensive lines within the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. The Russians continue offensive operations, and what we're seeing is that the Ukrainians have adapted a new tactic here to the north of Pokrovsk, where what we've previously seen is that the Russians are now launching offensive operations. If they get a breakthrough, they double down on that. But if the Ukrainians rotate their forces to deal with that operation, they attack other sectors of the front line. An example is the north of Pokrovsk. They managed to gain control over a wide area within a quick part of time, through which they pushed and doubled down on their push. Then the Ukrainians responded by rotating a lot of their forces. Then the Russians started pushing in the Dnipropetrovsk direction and Zaporizhia direction, gaining significant gains in those areas through this period of time, where they have not advanced at all in the northern flank of Pokrovsk. It's not that they're completely abandoning this section of the front line, it's that they are turning to the defensive and then prioritizing offensive operations elsewhere. This has allowed the Russians to make significant gains on the western flank of the Donetsk region, but the northern flank in the direction of Pokrovsk has become very difficult with the Ukrainian counterattacks in the area, as the rotation of forces was large. So what has changed this time around is that the Ukrainians doubled down on their rotation. Instead of constantly moving from one place to another, they're looking to get rid of the Russian push here on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, man the defenses along the river line, and secure the positions in the area, which previously what they'd been working on was stopping the Russian offensive and then moving on to the next section of the front line once garrison forces were rotated in. But now they're actually launching an offensive operation to regain control over the area. However, the Russians were also prepared for this somewhat, as they quickly responded to the situation by launching these counterattacks, and they still have a significant amount of supplies to launch their own offensive operations. Although not very effective, they're still able to keep on the offensive. The Ukrainians have been able to regain control over significant portions of the front line and operationally encircle the Russian forces, but are under threat of encirclement themselves here on the northern and western flanks, where the Russians are attacking their supply lines. To cut off these supply lines will allow them to regain the advantage and reverse the situation for the Ukrainian forces, despite the large rotation of Ukrainian forces in the area. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.